Welcome to Advanced TV Herstory, where hearty discussion of all things TV draws a nifty circle around the women who have made it all happen. In each installment, we endeavor to celebrate, educate, illustrate, or analyze, all in the hopes of reaching listeners with the message that TV and women are very much a part of our lives. And it's okie dokie, it's fine and dandy that we talk about it, at length, in detail, with delight. So find this podcast along the great ones at Libsyn, Google Music, iTunes, and Auto Radio. Engage with us on Twitter. Our handle is @TVHerstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams. I hope you enjoy this installment. Loyal listeners, it's all about the women in and of TV, right? If you could see my list of topics not yet explored in this podcast and the genres, oh my goodness, the genres, you'll know that my pursuit of the untold or undertold story of the women in and of TV is relentless. Take, for instance, the genre of children's television. You're not alone if you only remember Mr. Rogers and the male lead characters of Sesame Street and Captain Kangaroo, or Steve from Blue's Clues. But suiting up for the women were Nanette Fabray of Kukla, Fran and Ollie, go YouTube that one, Sherry Lewis, the puppeteer and voice behind Lamb Chop, a girl, Hush Puppy and Charlie Horse, and all the teachers of Romper Room. So today we're talking about one of the original teachers from Romper Room, Miss Sherri. Listeners of the Generation X and Millennial generations, you should know that Romper Room was like a slow-moving televised kindergarten, usually featuring 6 kids. It was in black and white in the beginning, and ultimately it evolved to color. These were well-mannered kids who helped baby boom kids get ready for classroom learning. By 1962, Miss Sherri Finkbine, actually Mrs. Finkbine, but she was known as Miss Sherri to the world, had been the teacher on Romper Room, which was filmed and syndicated out of Arizona on a regional basis for nearly 4 years. Within a matter of weeks, she, however, became more famous for a personal situation which played out in a public fashion, more famous than her career would ever come to be on the children's show. In fact, you will find out that her career ended quite prematurely. In 1962, studies were coming out of Europe documenting the widespread birth defects of babies born to mothers who had taken the drug thalidomide during their pregnancies. Thalidomide had been prescribed in the U.S. and abroad for sleeplessness and morning sickness. Happily married to a high school teacher, Miss Sherri took thalidomide in the early stages of her pregnancy with her 5th child. What transpired in the ensuing months helps us better understand American attitudes toward abortion, a woman's right to make a decision about a pregnancy, and the medical community at the time. It's true that 1962 was 55 years ago. Video preservation really didn't exist back then, so we are left with little audio to tell this story. But in 1992, 30 years after the major headlines that thalidomide made around the world, giving us then the factor that Miss Sherri's story played into people's attitudes toward choice, well, a made-for-TV movie entitled A Private Matter, starring Sissy Spacek and Aidan Quinn, told the story. So let's get this straight. A woman of TV, Miss Sherri, who was a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison's journalism program, raised American awareness of the dangers of thalidomide, and 30 years later, women in TV, namely Lindsay Doran and Joan Micklin Silver, produced and directed the story. The lines you'll hear from the movie reveal the often overlooked perspective of what Miss Sherri's situation must have been. Don't be surprised if any clip leaves you thinking, well, times have changed. Whew, thank you. But then reflect a moment later that maybe they haven't changed as much as we would have hoped. And of course, the movie clips in particular are told in the voice of 1992. Those were at that time still fairly rose-colored glasses with regard to the progress we estimated would be made for women's rights, for the questions of equality, for healthcare,
balls.
With big brown...
Balls. With big balls.
With big brown... Big brown... With spots. It's got big brown spots. That's what they're called. It's magic mirror time. Romper, bumper, stomper, boo. Tell me, do. Magic mirror, tell me today. Did all my friends have fun at play? Oh, I see Stevie and Mary. I see Linda and Tommy. And Judy, I hope you're feeling better today.
There have been many iterations of Romper Room over the years. In fact, during the 50s and 60s, regional TV stations had the option to access the show's format as a franchise, not as a singularly syndicated show that had gone national, such as Sesame Street was not that many years later. And IMDb chronicles the show's premiere in 1953 and details various teachers and versions, all the way up until presumably its demise in 1994. But like the curly top of ice cream of a Dairy Queen cone, teachers in all of those Romper Room shows looked through the handheld magnifying glass squarely into the camera and rattled off a list of names, of young kids' names, those who were the regular viewers. And when you think of it, it fits quite nicely into the highly competitive profile of the baby boom generation. Imagine 6-year-olds armed with a stack of postcards that they'd ask their moms to mail daily to the local TV station in hopes that their names would be read over the air. We've done this to ourselves, you guys. Okay, so now later in this installment, you'll hear some televised news coverage of Mr. Finkbine making a statement on his wife's behalf. In 1962, that would have been commonplace. Also in 1962, Miss Sherri, though employed, most likely didn't have a credit card in her name. The movie depicts her as being able to drive a car, and surely as a college graduate, she should have been part of the initial conversation between her doctor and her husband when the doctor confirmed through testing that the fetus was already showing signs of deformed limbs.
Sherri, you can deal with it.
How can we deal with it?
Dr. Warner says that we can arrange a termination, if that's what we want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could schedule you into Mercy Hospital for next Wednesday.
That's Mark's birthday.
That doesn't matter, honey. How long would it take?
The operation, no time at all. But we'll keep her in the hospital a couple of days.
Schedule it. We can always cancel it if we change our minds, right?
Oh, sure. Now, you've done nothing wrong, Sherri. It's the drug that's done the damage. So, it's not your fault, right?
When old feminists get charged up about the incremental progress in women's rights that has slowly been made over the last 50 years or so, having the autonomy over one's healthcare decision ranks right up there. We take it for granted today, but in 1962, men discussed the options and in this instance presented Miss Sherri with their recommendation. And if you need any further proof, wallow your way through the 1970 baby boom smash hit Love Story starring Ally McGraw and Ryan O'Neal. I'll just throw out the spoiler, if you're the last person in America who has not seen this movie, that McGraw's character, intended to be in her mid-20s, learns she has, we really never know, because her husband, played by Ryan O'Neal, has a conversation in whispers with his father, who he hates, played by Ray Milland, in the hallway outside her hospital room. Same deal. They come in with their story straight and a recommendation, that basically she's looking at death. Okay, back to Miss Sherri. Now, the movie tells the story that she's the one to tell one of her local news station friends that she knows of a woman who took thalidomide. She's trying hard not to reveal her own identity in this. The conversation evolves, and ultimately she reveals it to be her own situation. From there, it's not long before her identity is shared with the whole world. Why was telling the story of the situation important? Sherri answers this in her own words in an interview that appeared in a short video available on YouTube called Choice at Risk.
Everything would have been fine if I didn't have this fantastic feeling that I had to warn other people about this horrendous drug.
Sherri's actions, which would be attempting to prevent other women who might be pregnant from reaching into their medicine cabinets and taking thalidomide or obediently accepting a prescription for it from their 65-year-old white male family physician, were laudable. The movie does a good job of revealing how her news and name became public. But it had to have been her role as a woman of TV that made the news all the more worthy of not just Arizona-based recognition, but in fact national coverage. A Private Matter, the movie's other moral track, is the soft ground held by the medical community. The Finkbines were told that her pregnancy could be terminated as long as it was determined that her life was somehow in danger. The movie shows a visit she had with a psychiatrist where he basically fills in her unfinished sentences in order for him to render a conclusion that she is in fact suicidal from the stress of carrying a deformed fetus. And ultimately, all throughout the movie, it's clear that the notion of terminating pregnancies was tolerated so long as it was never really shared with the general population.
Different species altogether, you know?
This is serious, Bob. They don't like this at Mercy Hospital. It makes them nervous. They've asked me to postpone the operation for a week while they get a legal ruling.
Postpone? What does that mean?
They're asking a court to rule that the operation is within the law.
I thought you said it was legal. I thought you said there were ways.
There's ways so long as nobody talks about it. Sherri's got it as good a case as any. As long as she doesn't tell the kids about it on the Romper Room show.
Now we can still cover the legal angle. Ray, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call the county attorney.
Good. Hi, Sherri.
Hi, Ray.
Looking good today? Hey, terrific story just broke. Phoenix woman's abortion. I mean, it's got everything. It's got an evil drug company, court battle, mercy killing, crime, religion. I mean, it's got every damn thing.
Not everything. Hasn't got cute.
Hey, you don't know that.
She will turn out to be some overweight migrant who doesn't speak English.
It's still a great story, though. I mean, 5 years in the slammer or a monster baby. What a choice.
Bill, I want to crew down at the courthouse right away. Hang on a sec. Ray, you go down there, you nail Gillespie. If he says he's going to prosecute, you go with a mother's agony. If he says he won't, you go with respect for the law. Yeah, hi, Bill.
So here we are, about halfway through the movie, and Sissy Spacek is delivering an outstanding performance of a woman who is now being judged for every move she makes. Her therapeutic abortion, as local doctors have called it, is on hold until a court can make a decision, which it ultimately decides not to do. She's got 4 kids at home already. Her mother can't fathom her need to own the decision, and her husband, lo and behold, well, does it come as a surprise that at some point this whole matter needs to be about him? According to the law, abortion of any kind at that time, 1962, was illegal. Doctors were able to benevolently assign loopholes, such as harm to the mother, and handle things privately. It was all hush-hush.
I can't take the heat.
Al, now you brought us this lady. Does she have a good case for termination?
Yes.
I think so, too. So we'll hang together.
Look, every time the woman steps out the door, the story gets bigger and bigger. She's just too photogenic.
How is she handling that?
That's not the point. The point is she keeps yapping her mouth off to everybody.
All right. I will admit her to the hospital today.
Ahead of the court ruling?
Absolutely. We'll just do it under another name.
Okay, good.
Oh, am I in the right place?
Sure are. We thought you might be more comfortable coming in this way. Just right down the hall here.
I'm Steve Morris, the hospital administrator. One of the few people who knows you're here. It seems that everybody in the world wants to know all about you, but I'll see to it that you're not bothered here.
What did you say your name was?
Steve Morris.
I can't afford this, Mr. Morris.
Don't worry about it. The hospital will pick up the check. It's better for everybody if you're out of circulation for a while.
I'm contagious.
You're not the only one, Mrs. Finkbine. We do a lot of terminations here.
Then why am I...
Because you've been open about it all, I guess.
I can do it if I think I'm wrong. But if I'm right, I have to be stopped.
I know it sounds crazy, but it's a crazy world we live in.
Late this afternoon, the court refused to rule in the controversial Sherri Finkbine case.
This movie has the mood of the early 60s down to a T, including the table of physicians meeting in what should have been the hospital doctor's lounge, dragging on cigarettes. Literally, ashtrays the size of small hubcaps appear on the table. There is no shortage of irony in that scene. So this is how decisions were made back then? Had Sherri not felt strongly about warning other women about thalidomide, she would have been quietly admitted to the hospital by her doctor, had the procedure, recuperated, and returned to Romper Room hardly any worse for the wear. Did her actions, which included outing the medical community's disregard for the law, did that permanently change hospital procedures? Did these conversations go on regularly in doctors' lounges around the country at that time? These are the questions that go through my head, and obviously they are fodder for a different kind of podcast, maybe advanced medical herstory, I don't know. In a short period of time, however, while carrying the fetus, Miss Sherri has left her own doctor powerless, had the local courts refuse to act on her case in light of federal law, and ultimately was turned down for service by her own local hospital. What options were left? Well, that was the conversation between her doctor and her husband. Someone please cue the theme from Love Story. I hear Ellie McGraw coughing.
We have to consider the effect this could have on the reputation of the hospital. How much of this stuff do we do around here anyway?
300 or 400 a year.
300 a year, one a day. Jesus, I had no idea.
Well, why should you? You're orthopedics.
I don't like it.
It's a little late for that now.
I never did like it.
Well, you never said so before.
Do you do this?
Sure. Well, what do you expect me to do? Send him down to the back streets to die?
How much do you charge?
What's that got to do with anything?
Well, that's the kind of thing people say.
And you operate for free, do you?
At least my operations are necessary.
I don't believe this.
Hey, now let's get back on track here. This is a woman in need and a lousy law.
It may be a lousy law, but it's the law, and we are not above it. Listen, I'm as willing as the next guy to go to jail on a point of principle. But what kind of moral crusade is abortion, for Christ's sake?
There are only a few interviews and news items of the Finkbine case on the internet, either as articles or video or audio. Miss Sherri was interviewed in 1992 by the New York Times when the movie A Private Matter aired. And so in that interview with the New York Times, Miss Sherri explains that she had long turned down offers to bring her story to the large or small screen. As she put it, quote, "I wasn't interested in turning myself into a sideshow," end quote. A Private Matter was brought forward, however, by the producers of A League of Their Own. Remember the movie about the women who played baseball during World War II? It was produced by Gary Marshall, among others. Miss Sherri must have found some assurance that they'd tell her story truly from a woman's point of view. That caused her to change her mind. According to the New York Times article of June 16, 1992, Miss Sherri was pleased with Sissy Spacek's performance. She thought there was one misstep, however, in the one very important scene. And here's her quote. The quote from the New York Times, which contains a quote from Miss Sherri. During the scene in which the Scottsdale hospital administrator gives her the news that she cannot have the abortion performed at that hospital, Ms. Chesson, who no longer Mrs. Finkbine, sounding like a proper doobie, and that's a Romper Room reference, notes, quote, Sissy was snippy to the hospital supervisor, and I think she should have said, thank you for trying, end quote, end quote. Hamstrung by the American legal and medical communities, the Finkbines, in real life, worked with their doctor to explore the possibility of an abortion in another country. Japan was their first country of inquiry, but it denied the request due to concerns about media exposure. The Finkbines ultimately went to Sweden. What you're about to hear is a news item clip from 1962, and it can be found on YouTube.
Sherri, what are your plans after Sweden?
I'm so worried about today that I just can't.
That unless Mrs. Sherri Finkbine.
I don't want to sue anybody. I don't want any money from anybody. I just want to do what's right for myself and my family, and I think I think you know me well enough to see me under saner conditions. I feel mentally like about a 1/10 of what I used to be, and I don't want to get back at anybody. I don't feel bitter towards anyone. I don't feel bitter towards people who oppose us religiously. I only hope that they can feel that we're doing what's best in our case, and could feel some of what's in my heart in trying to prevent a tragedy from happening.
I'd like to emphasize this, that we have our 4 children to consider. I think we're doing what's best for them. I want our 4 children to have a healthy, emotionally stable mother, rather than have 5 children with a mother that's a emotional wreck. From the standpoint of our family, our children, my wife's health, from the standpoint of this unborn child, I think that we're sincerely doing the right thing. I'd like to really emphasize, and I'm so sincere about this, we're not making a decision for other people. This is right for our family and in our particular case. I'm not saying it's right for another family in the same situation. I respect other people's beliefs, religiously and morally. I can see why they might oppose this, and that's fine. They should, if that's the way they believe. But we're not deciding for them or for anybody else. We're deciding for ourselves, our family, and I think it's right for us. I'm not saying it's right for anyone else.
Throughout the movie A Private Matter, the viewer really gets the feel for the media frenzy that surrounded this family during these terrible weeks of medical limbo. It obviously can't compare to today, but in 1962, TV reporting was becoming mobile, local news often made it onto national radio, and newspapers were still the backbone of American culture. And this story was well covered. It was documented. The reporters, all of whom seemed to be men, but I'm not going to bank on that statement, were in fact tenacious. At least that's how it comes across in the movie. And people on the whole were cruel. It's really hard to imagine what the Finkbines must have gone through. Sherri Finkbine has largely been out of the spotlight since 1962, but here is a bit more of audio from a short video of her story produced by Choice at Risk and directed by Dorothy Fadiman.
When we came back from Sweden, we heard that somebody else was now doing Romper Room and that they felt I was unfit to handle children. We had received so many death threats that the FBI was called. They came because people threatened to cut off the arms and legs of my existing children.
Now that it's all over, do you still think that you've done the right thing?
More than ever. Something within me, I don't know if it was womanly intuition or the God inside of me said, don't have this baby, and I didn't, and now I know it was the right decision.
The drug thalidomide made for a big question of medical ethics and reproductive rights in a day when the women's movement was only starting to really form. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, which many credit with launching the more public face of the women's movement, was published in 1963. This is all context for you guys. Roe versus Wade, which was the legal challenge to the federal law that at that time governed the land, and it ultimately gave women the right to choose whether to carry a fetus or not, for whatever reason, was decided in 1973. In the 50s and 60s and through the mid-70s, pregnancy was not necessarily a condition that merited many warnings to change behavior. Do we have Sherri Finkbine to thank for being one of the many voices to advocate for women's health at a time when it was basically untended? It sure seems so. And that progress fed into the women's movement and the rights, freedoms, and knowledge that we have today. Whew, thank you, Sherri. Please, if you have an hour and a half, view A Private Matter. It's available on YouTube, though it can also be found on DVD. It's as close to a documentary of Miss Sherri's situation as you'll find, and it's really, really worth viewing. The decision in 1992 by Miss Sherri to have someone put her story to video was a really good one. The timing was excellent. I am not sure today whether there would be interest, or maybe there is interest in bringing that back to life. It certainly is an important time in American herstory and in TV herstory as well. Because when you get to the end of that movie and you understand all she has endured to be able to act on her own decision, the complexity of her situation is the question of her own self-determination. There is no sugarcoating about this. This is her decision based on the knowledge of the condition of her fetus and what that child's life would likely be. So every step of the way, Miss Sherri's conviction that women should know the effects of thalidomide, even at her own expense, never wavered. That in and of itself is a testament to her leadership and her own self-awareness. So listeners, thank you for being a part of this important, albeit heavy topic and weighing through to the very end. Audio that you've heard from A Private Matter was pulled from the DVD. The two excerpts of audio that were taken of the Finkbines come from YouTube, and they're contained in a clip posted by Huntley Film Archives, which would be another place that I would love to hang out in for a while. Huntley is one of the largest independent film libraries in the UK, with a collection of more than 80,000 titles. That would keep me busy. Also, excerpts of interviews of Sherri herself were taken from the short biographical sketch Choice at Risk, which was directed by Dorothy Fadiman. Now, you should know that the place called Core Temp Arts, which you'll find online, Core Temp Arts, CORETEMP Arts, ARTS.com, features a host of other independent podcasts that take great interest in all things TV and pop culture. Take, for instance, one other podcast called Everything is Awesome, or another entitled The Broken Brain. These are folks who've got a lot to say. However, Advanced TV Herstory wants to know if you have anything to say. Do you have some untold or undertold women in TV stories that you think should be covered in this podcast? Send them right away to me at advancedtvherstory@gmail.com. You'll find scripts and access to the entire vault of past podcast installments at www.tvherstory.com. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is TV Herstory. Girls and women, all of us learn from the women we see on TV. And more often than not, the best ones are brought to us by the women in the TV industry, those writers, producers, and directors who are still woefully outnumbered by men. We must learn from the past to support a stronger future. And that's why you're listening to Advanced TV Herstory. I'm your host, Cynthia Bemis Abrams.
Thank you for listening to the Court Arts Podcast Network. To listen to more Court Arts shows, visit courtemparts.com.